Bonsoir, je suis Sergei Guriev, directeur de la formation et de la recherche à Sciences Po. Moi-même, je suis un économiste, aussi citoyen russe. Je suis sorti de la Russie l'année 2013 sur les raisons à cause des désagréments graves avec M. Poutine. Et je travaillais après sur les sujets d'Europe, Ukraine. J'ai été économiste en chef de la BERD, Banque européenne de reconstruction et développement. Et donc, dans cette qualité-là, je travaillais beaucoup avec les collègues ukrainiens. Et maintenant, je suis impliqué aussi sur le sujet des plans de reconstruction, blueprint for reconstruction of Ukraine après la guerre. Et donc, maintenant, je vais parler sur le sujet de la guerre, pourquoi cette guerre a commencé, qu'est-ce qu'on peut attendre et qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire maintenant. Mais quand ce sujet est vraiment, vraiment sensible, je vais m'exprimer en anglais, donc je vais passer à l'anglais. Désolé pour ça, mais c'est vraiment un sujet où mon français est trop limité. Donc, il y a beaucoup de mots où il faut choisir les mots précis. Donc, I will indeed talk about what has happened, why this horrible war has started, what is going on, what is going to happen, what we know and don't know about the present and the future of this war, and what we should do about this war. Now, first and foremost, if we scroll back to 89, the fall of the war, or 91, the disintegration of Soviet Union, you see a great sense of optimism that the history is ended. There is a famous book by Francis Fukuyama, first article in Foreign Affairs, and then the book, The End of History. Many people have a very simplistic view of this book, but in the end, when people think about this book and this argument, there was this optimistic view that the history is ended. We will never see the war. We will never see the divide of Europe. And yet, the history has returned. The history has returned with vengeance. Now, I see a lot of students here who sometimes ask themselves, why should we study history if we want to work in business? And the answer is this. Now, suddenly you know that studying history is important for understanding business challenges as well. Now, coming back to this war, the war for an economist is an insult. We economists work a lot on how to increase economic efficiency, how to make sure that economy grows, that we have resources for helping the poor people, we have resources for addressing great social challenges such as climate change. And when something like this happens and destroys, already in the year of 2022, this war destroyed $1 trillion of global output, of global incomes. This is a disaster and an intellectual insult, in a sense that we need to understand what has happened, what went wrong, why the end of history has not actually materialized. And so let me tell you a story of political economy of Putin's regime, because we need to understand what drove this particular person and his entourage to launch this catastrophic war. And when I say catastrophic, it's not just catastrophic for Ukraine, it's also catastrophic for Russia. And I believe, in net terms, it's actually a very, very bad decision for Putin himself. Now, Putin came to power in, some people would say, summer of 1999, when he was appointed by Yeltsin as prime minister. Some people would say he won an election in March 2000. And as we know right now, he immediately started thinking about corruption, palaces, yachts, and he immediately started attacking media freedom. However, it took him quite a while to actually establish control over the media, over the courts, over business groups, and it is only in 2003 or 2004 it became clear what his project is. Until then, some reforms continued. Russia actually started to grow very fast, And that, of course, supported Putin's popularity. As a scholar of non-democratic regimes, I can tell you that Putin is not alone. There are other non-democratic leaders who initially come to power in democratic way, and if they're fortunate or competent to launch economic growth early on, they often get this boost of popularity from rising incomes. And this is what Putin did. Putin was lucky to come to power at the very low moment of Russian economy. Russian economy collapsed in 1998, and then, after a great devaluation of ruble, of 4 times in nominal terms, it started to grow again. Oil prices started to increase, and they actually grew all the way until 2008, when we observed oil prices of $140 per barrel. I see many young people here, you probably don't remember that, but today's oil prices are actually not that high relative to summer 2008. In addition to that, the reforms of 1990s and of early 2000s, when Putin still has not subverted political and legal institutions, these reforms started to bring fruit, and Russia, for 10 years, between 1999 and 2008, grew on average at 7% per year. As a scholar of economic history of Russia, I can tell you that's never been a decade in recorded economic history of Russia of such a successful economic growth. The only comparison could be 1920s, the new economic policy era, but even then, growth did not last that long. Now, that brought Putin immense popularity. If you look at his approval ratings at the height of his popularity in 2008, his approval ratings were in the range of 80%. Russians saw the decline in freedoms, capture of the courts, subversion of various political and legal checks and balances, but they also saw doubling of GDP per capita, tripling wages, even adjusted for inflation, and that, of course, increased support for the regime. Now, as I said, his takeover of the political and legal system continued, and interestingly, it started also to spread to the economy. Corruption, all economists will tell you, is not good for economic growth. So when Putin's corruption and recapture of business by the state started to spread in the second presidential term between 2004 and 2008, many people already started to say it's not going to end well. And yet, with oil prices at $140 per barrel, of course, Russia continued to grow. Now, 2008 comes, there is a big crisis, Russian economy collapses. There's been a number of policy mistakes, among other things. Then global economy starts to recover, oil prices start to recover, Russian economy starts to recover. And then what happens once economy recovers to pre-crisis levels, it stops growing. And this is something that people forget, that actually economic model of Putin ran out of steam even before 2014. Because corruption played a role undermining investment climate, and the spread of state companies, state corporations also started to undermine level playing field competition, and of course, again, incentives for domestic and foreign investment. Now, as economic growth declined to 1% in 2013, compared 7% a year and 1% a year in 2013, Putin's popularity also went down to something like 60%. Now, for a democratic leader, 60%, dream, right? But for somebody who controls all domestic politics, all the media, all the courts, that's actually a signal certain things are not going in the right direction. So he started to look around for ways to improve his legitimacy. This is exactly when we started to disagree a lot, because my advice to him was, look, we need to reform the judiciary system, we need to reintroduce political competition, we need to open up. Otherwise, look around. Did you see what happened in the Arab Spring to certain dictators who wanted to stay in power for too long? And so these discussions are discussions he doesn't like at all. And so in fact, that eventually, on my personal level, resulted in me moving to this place I'm very happy I'm here. So on the other hand, what happened, he was looking for solutions, and one solution he found was annexation of Crimea. So there is a revolution of dignity in Ukraine. Ukrainians reject Putin's economic integration model. This is something he was trying to impose on Ukraine year after year since 2009, when he created so-called customs union, initially including Belarus and Kazakhstan, and he wanted to bring Ukraine into this customs union. Europe suggested to Ukraine the alternative, which was DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement. The president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, said to Europeans, I will sign it. The society was very happy. And then at some point, Putin threatened Yanukovych and also bribed Yanukovych. He actually used the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund to lend money to Yanukovych. This money will not ever come back to Russia. Ukrainians are refusing to pay them back. But Yanukovych actually said no to Europeans, and that triggered the revolution of dignity. People went to the street. People were shot at, and yet they prevailed. About 100 of people died in the streets of Kyiv, yet this revolution has happened. Yanukovych fled, and Putin decided to act. And the result of this annexation of Crimea was beyond any belief. And we saw that Putin's popularity went from the 60% to 90%. That was, I think, something he himself didn't expect. It turns out, as we discovered, that Russia is a post-imperialistic country and is still an imperialistic country. And for many Russians, this post-imperialistic nostalgia is very important. Now, we are in France, where this sentiment is also familiar. Luckily, that's a thing of the past. In Russia, it's still very sensitive, and Putin used it very well. Now, this war was mostly bloodless, especially annexation of Crimea. The war in the east of Ukraine was not bloodless. About 15,000 people died over those 8 years. And yet, the main success was actually in Crimea, where one person died. And this is the Crimean annexation that brought him the boost in popularity. Now, what happens afterwards? So 2014 brought him this boost, and then economy doesn't grow at all. Why? Because of the very same problems, that investment is not coming, corruption is high, there is a domination of state and friends of Putin, personal friends of Putin, literally people he trained together for judo in his youth, or his neighbors from Dacha. These are the people who are running the country and business together with him. So economy is not growing. Incomes in 2021, before the war, were still 10% below the level of income in 2013. So think about this, 10% decline in incomes, and so of course that resulted in decline in Putin's popularity. And so the other factor is, of course, the spread of new information technology. We complain a lot about internet as a disinformation technology. We talk a lot how Twitter empowered Trump and provided a platform for various extreme right politicians. But in many authoritarian countries, of course, internet is a liberation technology. It increases transparency. It provides an uncensored platform. And this is exactly what happened not just in Egypt in 2011, but also in Russia in those recent years, where the main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, used YouTube as a main platform to reach out to Russians and tell them that first, Putin is corrupt. Second, his corruption is killing the economy. Third, there is an alternative. And Alexei Navalny himself, both online and offline, tried to reach out to Russians and say, I will run for president. He was never registered, but he actually ran a campaign in 2017 and saw a lot of people. And this is when Putin sent, for the first time, he sent this hit squad to follow Navalny. That's when Navalny said, I will run for president, I will travel around Russia, I will talk to people. That's exactly when these people started to follow him. Now, We are approaching 2022. What is happening there? Putin's popularity is low. Actually, during the pandemic, in 2020, it went even below the lowest point ever in this century. Even though Putin poisoned Navalny, put him in jail, people remain unhappy. People kept asking questions. If you are in power for 20 years, previously you complained that there are various checks and balances that don't allow you to implement your project of Great Russia. Now there are no checks and balances. You can do whatever you want. This is your full discretion, and yet incomes don't grow. And so he was looking for another solution, and he thought that he can replay annexation of Crimea. If he enters Ukraine, captures Kyiv in a week, replaces government in Kyiv, Ukraine joins Russian sphere of influence, he goes back home and says, I'm a victorious leader again. Maybe incomes are low, but we are a great country, and nobody can stand up to us. Now, he was not alone, because, as you may remember, many Western leaders actually said that Kyiv will fall after several days. That was the consensus, and in that sense, Putin underestimated Ukrainian resistance, but he was not alone. Now, that was his calculus. He thought that that would be 2014 once again. Now, why did he underestimate Ukrainians? Why did he overestimate his own army? Why did he underestimate the unity of the West, which responded immediately with unprecedented sanctions? Well, there are several reasons here, but the main reason is in a dictatorship, you are bound to make mistakes because you don't have independent media, you don't have loud opposition that criticizes your decisions, you don't have civil society, you don't have feedback. People who would like to argue with you are gone. They cannot speak because you kick them out. And in that sense, these mistakes were actually quite natural to make. On the other hand, he also lacked expertise on Ukraine. He also lacked expertise on Western capacity. But of course, the West also demonstrated that it's not as weak, it's not as strong, it's not as united as before, for example, through the disorderly exit of the US from Afghanistan. I strongly believe that it was one of the factors that convinced Putin that he can actually do this now. Now, he enters Ukraine, underestimating Ukrainian will to resist, overestimating his own army, and again, as I said, underestimating the readiness of the West to react. Now, the sanctions that the West put in place were unprecedented. Already now, Russia is the world champion in number of sanctions. Iran has been in this business for decades. For Russia, it's just half a year was enough to have, in terms of number of people sanctioned, number of companies sanctioned, and of course, amount of money sanctioned, because on the third day of the war, the Central Bank of Russia, with its immense foreign currency reserves, going into hundreds of billions of dollars, were frozen. I was participating in an exchange with a G7 finance minister on the first day of the war, and that person was asking, what shall we do? And then one of the people on the exchange said, look, go for reserves of Russian Central Bank. And I said, this is unprecedented. You cannot do that. You've never done that. You will not be able to get a coalition of the willing to go for it. But then they did it 3 days later. These sanctions are very new. We have Singapore joining the sanctions. We have Switzerland joining the sanctions. You know, in Russia, after 2014, you cannot buy French cheese. People would come to Paris, buy cheese from here and bring it back to Russia. But Swiss cheese was available. Now, even that is gone. And Russian reserves in Swiss francs are also frozen. That created major macroeconomic instability. But interestingly, and this is a special personal pain for me, many economists working in finance ministry, central bank, actually did a great job stabilizing the economy. I'm saying that's painful for me because I know these people. Some of them worked with me. Some of them actually took my courses. And for me, it's a special personal tragedy that people continue doing their job, knowing that if they deliver additional resources to Russian state, these resources will be used to kill Ukrainians. Now, economy is stabilized, but then the new shock comes, which is trade sanctions. The restrictions for exporting sensitive technology to Russia hit semiconductors, jet engines, high-grade steel, and so on. And Russia was more or less ready for that, but what Russia was not ready for was the voluntary exit of 1,200 Western companies from Russia. That really, really hit Russian ability to function. Russian imports went down by half. And we have this unprecedented, once again, unprecedented experiment. What happens when you stop trading with the outside world if you traded before? Now, Iran is a different story, North Korea is a different story, but Russia was integrated in the global economy. And suddenly this level of integration went down by half, and suddenly Russia discovered that it used to produce cars, but it can't any longer. So just to give you a number, in May 2022, Russia produced less than 4,000 cars. This is 30 times less than in May 2021. Now, things now are getting better, but still production of cars is nowhere near the pre-war level. And that other industries also were hit by that. And in that sense, this is something that nobody expected. But the real sanction is still not happening. The real sanctions are sanctions against Putin's exports of oil and gas to Europe. Every day, Europe pays Russia, depending on the day, from $500 million to $800 million in purchases of oil and gas. Putin spends on the war about $500 million per day. So every additional dollar you pay for Russian oil and gas is eventually a dollar Putin spends to recruit soldiers. Nobody wants to go to this war for free. Putin has to go to poorest regions of Russia and pay these people 10 times their incomes. Putin's emissaries actually go to prisons, recruit convicts to go to war and promise to pay them. And for that, Putin needs cash. And that cash right now is coming from Europe. In the end of May, beginning of June, European Union agreed to impose oil embargo on Russia. This embargo will start in December. In addition to that, G7 agreed that they will introduce oil price cap on Russian oil and enforce it through insurance embargo, insurance on Russian oil tankers, and the secondary sanctions on whoever breaks the oil price cap. And this is when the real impact will actually start. This is when Putin's fiscal position will become much more difficult than today. Putin's already facing a major decline in GDP. The data on GDP are now being manipulated. A month ago, I would actually tell you that I believe GDP data, and I would tell you that in the second quarter, Russian GDP was 6% below seasonally adjusted. Then in the first quarter, the fall by 6% within a quarter is a huge fall comparable to 20% in annual terms. So it's a huge speed of decline. But then Russia actually retroactively changed the data for pre-war quarters, and now the fall is much smaller. Russia classified data on trade. Russia classified data on detailed budget lines and spending and so on. So analyzing Russian economy is hard now. But in July already, Russian budget was in the red by about 8% of GDP. In August, Russia cut some spending. It's 3% of GDP. So budget lines are very, very important. And in December, I think we'll see something really painful for Putin. This is why Putin is now trying to blackmail Europe and tries to remove these sanctions, especially the oil embargo, which is coming. This is why we hear today in Europe the narrative that Putin publicly promotes at home and his friends promote in Europe. The narrative is we cannot support the war. Nobody among those politicians who would say before the war, Putin is a great leader, we love you, now can say that. They say Putin has changed. We knew a nice good Putin before the war, now there is a different Putin. Evil Putin who invaded Ukraine, we don't support the war, but let's remove sanctions, because sanctions don't hurt Putin. They hurt us, Europeans. And I'm running out of time, so I will not overburden you with numbers, data, but the data tell you a very simple story. The impact on Russian economy is an order of magnitude larger than impact on European economy. People say there is no impact because you don't see big protests in Russia. You see protests in European countries. But the reason is, today in Russia, if you protest against the war, you go to jail for 10 years. And in that sense, you shouldn't be surprised. But Putin's economy is suffering. It will suffer even more. And this is required to stop the war. If you don't want to send soldiers to Ukraine, you need to send weapons to Ukraine, and you need stop sending money to Putin, because this is what he needs to continue recruiting soldiers, to continue killing Ukrainians and destroying Ukrainian cities. Thank you very much.